Guyana is a country of 83,000 square miles located on South America's northeastern Atlantic coast. Divided into 10 administrative regions, general and regional elections are held using those administrative regions as the country's 10 electoral districts. Guyana joined the ranks of oil-producing nations in 2019, with the first commercial discovery of oil in May 2015. With the A Partnership for National Unity and Alliance for Change coalition government restoring decency, integrity, and national pride, and with oil revenue expected to catapult development, Guyana was on the rise. But 3 years into the coalition's term of government, after the reading of the country's 2019 national budget, the then opposition People's Progressive Party Civic colluded with Charandas Persaud, a member of parliament of the then President David Granger-led APNU AFC, and successfully brought a motion of no confidence in the National Assembly, effectively crippling the APNU AFC government and triggering early elections.
It was treachery.
Yes.
It was total, it's so disgusting and an infamy.
The March 2nd, 2020 general and regional elections plunged Guyana into a period of political deadlock and 5 months of crisis. The nation witnessed a concerted and coordinated effort by internal and external forces to rob the people of Guyana of our right to self-determination. This attack on the will of the people resulted in a theft of democracy. This presentation will examine how the People's Progressive Party Civic stole the March 2020 elections in Guyana and what this means for our country and democracy. In the short months since the installation of the PPPC, we have seen a resurgence in the illicit drug trade. The brutal murders of Joel and Isaiah Henry and Harish Singh, a return to the days of execution-style killings, and the gross mismanagement of Guyana's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The terror we are witnessing is a frightening reminder that the nation is in danger of being plunged back into the sorrows of the previous 23 years of PPPC rule. So, who would want them back in power? And how did they accomplish this bold theft of an election? Let's explore the facts. A false narrative about the March 2020 elections has been propagated by international and national forces, which sought to paint the APNU AFC as involved in a scheme to rig the March 2020 elections, when in fact there was a coordinated effort led by the PPPC locally and supported by international actors.
For one to understand what has happened, the PPP had developed a narrative from the time the election process started, in which they were contending that the elections were going to be rigged. And so they were socializing the international community into believing that the elections will be rigged.
The truth is, the rigging of elections is not new to the PPPC. While they have painted themselves as victims, the PPPC has engaged in electoral fraud in every election that they have contested in their history.
The People's Progressive Party Civic historically has mastered the art of rigging and then seeking to change the narrative. We can go straight back to the 1947 election where the PPP refused to give up after by-election. We can go to the 2011 elections, where they fraudulently took the AFC seat and gave it to the then Prime Minister and then refused to bring the petition. The PPP has historically had sophisticated ways of rigging elections. First, they use fear so that in their communities, even people who oppose them will be afraid to stand up. Then they ensure that the persons appointed in those polling stations are PPP persons who will serve the PPP interests, and they are not independent actors. So there are a plethora of ways in which the PPP undermines the electoral system and ensure that they stay in power.
When the people triumphed in 2015 and ousted the PPPC from office, the nation erupted with joy and relief. A new day was nigh.
Guyana was actually at a point where we were actually being respected by the world. Our people were proud to say that they are Guyanese. They could have gone all around the world to be respected. Guyana was basically shining on the international stage again under the APNU-AFC administration. Those features of democracy, those features of transparency, those features of accountability were very, very important to us.
And as the APNU-AFC moved forward with its anti-corruption agenda, its war on illicit drugs, and its focus on building a safe and peaceful Guyana, the PPP sat in opposition and began their plot to steal the seat of government from the democratically elected APNU-AFC. In March 2019, the PPPC rehired Washington-based political lobbying firm Mercury Public Affairs, with which it had a long-standing relationship and which is embroiled in the scandals surrounding alleged Russian interference in United States elections. According to the New York Times, federal prosecutors also investigated the flow of foreign money to Mercury, which had been recruited by Paul Manafort, former President Trump's elections campaign chairman, who was later convicted for financial fraud. Kemraj Ramjatan, leader of the Alliance for Change, explains.
In 2014, Donald Ramotar and the People's Progressive Party as a whole paid $420,000 to Cambridge Analytica after they found out that Cambridge Analytica can make you win elections. Okay? And Cambridge Analytica then started the process of identifying thousands of Guyanese who are persuadables, who can hate the coalition and love the PPP and can make a switch to go there, knowing their profiles, their psychological profiles. It is a very comprehensive set of surveys that they have to do, but they have a skill and an art and the technologies to do that. Mercury was not any public relations firm. Mercury was a co-partner with British Analytica since 2015-2014 time when Donald Ramotar had made the payment of $420,000. Then Jagdeo made 130 or 34 million Guyana dollars, the equivalent to Mercury.
The plan was set in motion when in November of 2018, the then opposition leader Barrett Jagdeo tabled a no-confidence motion against the David Granger-led government. On December 21st, 2018, Charandas Persaud, who sat in the National Assembly as an Alliance for Change member, voted for the Jagdeo-sponsored no-confidence motion. With this act of treachery, Persaud plunged Guyana into constitutional and political crisis. Persaud was later rewarded for his efforts by the PPPC with an appointment as Guyana's High Commissioner to India.
It was, in my opinion, my dear, one of the most treacherous acts in the history of Guyana. On the day itself, knowing the very importance of the no confidence motion, Amna, as chief whip, along with Moses Nagamoto, called a meeting in one of the committee rooms and indicated that the motion will be started in an hour's time. We want everybody to understand that this can bring down our government if any one of us do stupidness. And of course, everybody was asked, how will you vote? Because we wanted to test it there. Moses, no, this, no, that, no, everybody, no. The loudest no came from that fella, Charandas.
Charandas would flee the country in the wee hours of the morning of December 22nd, 2018. Persaud, a Canadian citizen, was escorted to the Eugene F. Correa International Airport under the protection of the then High Commissioner of Canada to Guyana, Lillian Chatterjee. He was also accompanied by PPP member Peter Ramsarup. The cloak of darkness escort to his flight hinted that the Canadian High Commission may have foreknown Persaud's intent to betray his party and was the first sign of the international interference and diplomatic overreach that would plague the Granger government in the coming months.
We are very concerned about that, whereby you're going to have members of the opposition doing that kind of thing and literally, and getting the person too, Charandas himself, to get involved in all of that. So for the purposes of bringing down a government. And then immediately after doing that on that night, all the arrangements seemingly being in place for him to get away to Canada.
With the no confidence motion passed, the APNU AFC government moved to respect the constitutional requirements while maintaining the functions necessary to the well-being of the people of Guyana. Committed to respecting the rule of law and with Guyana's development effectively stymied as the government would be unable to pass a budget, on February 19, 2019, President David Granger asked the Guyana Elections Commission, GECOM, to begin preparations for general and regional elections. Former President Granger accepted Jagdeo's pick for the post, and Justice Claudette Singh was sworn in. Her first order of business? Bringing a halt to the much-needed house-to-house registration, a decision she made without a vote of the Commission.
Well, it was discontinued by Madame Claudette Singh because she said that the time period for the elections was getting too long away from that time, that she was of opinion that the elections ought to be held after the no confidence motion. So she felt that a further continuation of the house-to-house process will take up a lot of time, and there were international pressures again. International pressures. They didn't want they were saying that, look, people can't go and impersonate and vote twice and do this and do that and so on. Notwithstanding the list is bloated.
The campaigns of the political parties began in earnest in the last half of 2019 as they aimed to win the hearts and minds of the people. The APNU AFC ran a clean and uplifting campaign which celebrated the progress that had been made between 2015 and 2020. Not so with the PPP.
I have to say that a number of things led to what transpired to be the most painful of elections in modern Guyana history. I don't know how you are informed about what Cambridge Analytica did with the Brexit vote and the Donald Trump vote, along with the Kamala Bissessar vote in Trinidad. But Cambridge Analytica is a big firm that gets into people's profiles in a country, and then knowing how people think, they can manage to do what is called psychops, to the extent of understanding how you can vote if certain ads are sent to you personally. In 2014, Donald Ramotar and the People's Progressive Party as a whole paid $420,000 to Cambridge Analytica after they found out that Cambridge Analytica can make you win elections.
The SCL group, or Cambridge Analytica, first started having discussions with President Ramotar, and while engaging with the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, who the president was a part of that party.
And how much money did the PPP spend on this?
This particular campaign was $420,000. For the support specifically that Cambridge would have given, and they would have spent a lot more than that on their local team and on the actual ad spend.
Something nefarious was afoot in the PPPC camp. Their plan, as we will see, was centered around taking advantage of the weaknesses created by a severely bloated voters list, which included people who had died since as early as 2001, and an insidious racist campaign waged on social media. Kemraj Ramjatan explains.
However, in 2015, they did not manage to start the process of sending the ads based on that survey to these individuals. Time, because of the no confidence motion around that time that Mr. Nagamutu had brought, got them all jittery and whatever. They used that, however, in the 2020 elections. And they managed to send personalized ads via Facebook to a lot of Indo-Guyanese that were persuadables that they could go back. Because remember, in that elections of 2015, a number of these people felt that they were very bad for the country, that is the PPP. However, they still had a heart for the PPP. They managed to send to these people, especially the Hindu community. I'm now learning from the several pundits who told me about getting personalized ads, and they were very racial. Now, me and you and all members of the APNU AFC coalition, we dealing very legally and in accordance with lawful action with ads. It got to be non-racial, it got to be very legitimate and legal advertisement. But in the darkness of the internet, this is what the PPP was doing to what is called the persuadables. That is the only reason they took Analytica, Cambridge Analytica, and Mercury.
Election day went smoothly, with the exception of the first hint that something was afoot, occurring when General Secretary of the People's National Congress, Amna Ali, and Basil Williams, then Attorney General, were forced to confront Anil Nandalal, PPPC executive member who became Attorney General in the Ali administration. There were allegations that Mr. Nandalal was engaged in the distribution of national identification cards to prospective voters in District 4 on the lower east coast of Demerara. This development would prove to be significant, as the lower east coast of Demerara would emerge as the epicenter of electoral fraud committed by the PPPC.
Where was that? Hold on. Where was that? It was alleged that you've been distributing ideas. I was called here to resolve. I was called here as a group. I'm telling you that it was alleged that you were distributing. Well, that is not so well.
the election day proceedings were deemed to be overall free and fair by observers, and the Guyana Elections Commission, GECOM, proceeded with tabulation of the results. In the wee hours of March 4th, 2020, however, this process was derailed and the entire election cast in doubt when the PPPC and a group of political party leaders led by then Leader of the Opposition Barrett Jagdeo, presidential candidate Ifran Ali, and former Phantom Squad operatives invaded the Media and Tabulations Office on High and Hatfield Streets. Representatives of international missions and observers groups were also on the scene. Leader of the Opposition, Joseph Harmon, gives his views on this matter.
The 2nd of March, for all intents and purposes, went relatively smoothly. I say relatively because there were incidents which took place on that day itself that would characterize it as being not as smooth as it ought to be, and I say relatively. So that after the election, the voting was completed on the 2nd of March, and the Elections Commission started to do its work to claim a victory. And this was not just only a local arrangement, it was an arrangement which involved foreign players as well. They had created this illusion of a victory and even put out results which were created before people voted and had it posted on the internet, which showed that they had won. Results which were dated the 28th or the 29th of February, because I think that the year had 29, that was a year of a February 29 days. And so dated that day, even before people voted on the 2nd of March. So this was all created, this was all a narrative that they had prepared well beforehand, knowing fully well that they did not have the popular support on the ground.
A shocking display of aggression and threatening behavior ensued as GECOM staff were terrorized and bullied. Another invasion of GECOM occurred on March 5th as the then opposition PPPC and their agents sought to obstruct GECOM from proceeding with its constitutional duties. It was reported that GECOM chair Justice Singh was barricaded in her office, which was eventually breached by the PPPC insurrectionists. Officers of the Guyana Police Force struggled to bring order to the situation.
They orchestrated what I call an invasion, a démarche on the Elections Commission office in District 4. And so there was a stampede, almost, on the office of the Elections Commission in District 4. But because our system is not as developed as others in the developed world, I can now fast track to the 6th of January as to what happened on Capitol Hill in the United States of America, for people to understand what happened here on the 4th of March, 2020, when the supporters of Donald Trump invaded Capitol Hill and behaved in all sorts of manners, saying that they wanted to stop the actual verification of the votes.
In the wake of these events, the silence of the various international observer groups and missions was deafening. In fact, their presence and actions during the invasions ought to be closely scrutinized. What was the role of the ABCEU countries and their representative organizations in what occurred between March 4th and 5th is a question that must be answered.
The entire PPP executive, they had assembled the foreign diplomats who were here in Guyana, were all present, and so it's as if this was a stage production. You had something that prepared and you call up all of your supporters and all the troops and say, okay, this is what is going to happen. So everybody is there. And so there was a mashing up of the election office. Broke down doors, carried out boxes. These are all captured on tape.
The aggression by the PPPC against the GCOM offices fueled their supporters, and on March 6, 2020, violent protests erupted in the villages of Lusignan and Monrepo. PPPC supporters burned tires, blocking the main public roads along the lower East Coast corridor.
So that was what I call election violence. Election violence. And it triggered violence perpetrated by the PPP in many of the electoral districts of this country.
A violent mob at Bath Settlement unleashed a horrific attack on a school bus donated by former President David Granger. 4 school children were injured. A policeman was shot, and a protester lost his life after he attacked police. A car transporting a nurse and her young children were attacked, forcing them to flee for their lives.
Anytime the PPP wants to mobilize, they want violent confrontation, they go to that community. And so they had these fires and so on the street. The police came to try to bring some order, and they were confronted. They were confronted by hooligans. People were chasing a police unit with cutlasses on the road. One of the persons who was involved in that, I think the police shot him, and he unfortunately died as a result of this. But several of the policemen, including a sergeant and 2 constables, were chopped, viciously chopped, and had to be rushed to the hospital. Policemen were plunging in trenches and so on to get away from this violent mob that had been activated by Barra Jagdeo and the PPP executive.
In the face of uncertainty surrounding the GCOM process and significant distrust hanging over any result, in the national interest, then President David Granger turned to the then CARICOM chairman, Mia Motley, to supervise a total national recount of votes. The recount would be conducted by GCOM and supervised by a 3-member team from CARICOM. The Arthur Chung Conference Center was designated as the site for the national recount, and GCOM had the responsibility for ensuring that the facilities were set up in accordance with COVID-19 protocols, as the first cases of the virus had just begun to emerge in Guyana. The APNU AFC was optimistic that they would be vindicated by the recount process and be returned to office. The recount exercise would see for the first time in Guyana's history all ballot boxes from the 10 electoral districts being reopened before an official declaration of the elections by GCOM. Mr. Vincent Alexander is one of 3 APNU AFC nominated commissioners to the Guyana Elections Commission.
The Guyana Elections Commission could be considered to be having 2 aspects. The commission per se, which is made up of 7 commissioners, 3 commissioners who are nominated by the leader of the opposition, and 3 commissioners who are nominated by the president, all of whom are appointed by constitutional instrument by the president, and the chairperson, who is taken from a list by the president, presented to him by the leader of the opposition. And those 7 persons make up the commission, And for all intents and purposes, we are 7 commissioners, with the chairperson being the first among equals.
A total of 2,339 boxes were to be examined. 14 counting stations were established, along with a tabulation center. Each counting station would be manned by GCOM staff, and each political party was allowed 1 counting agent per station. Observers were allowed to scrutinize the proceedings.
My disposition to the recount is that there was an order, and I had a particular understanding of the order. That order provided for determination of the validity of ballots cast. That means that the order provided for the determination of whether people impersonated, etc., in the process of voting. And in fact, as far as I know, and I think there's factual evidence to show, that information was provided to show that there were people who were on the register of the dead, for whom votes were cast. There were people who were overseas, for whom votes were cast. And I am being very unequivocal about this.
The document that governed the recount was Order 60 of 2020, which set out clearly the process, which stated, 1, we will have the recount. That in the recount, there will be an observation report in which all the details of what transpired will be placed. And then the observation reports will be discussed, and you will arrive at a position as to the legitimacy of the elections.
On May 6, 2020, GCOM commenced the national recount that would last 33 days. Ganesh Maipal and Colin Bino were recount agents for the APNU AFC. They recall the optimism with which they entered the process and what they understood the aim of the process to be.
Everybody was excited at first. We were excited because we know we were going into a process expecting a credible count. We know that we were going to the National Recount Center at the Arthur Chung Conference Center to come out with a final credible count. That is what Order 60 of 2020 said, a final credible count. We also knew that in order to achieve a final credible count, every single vote in the ballot boxes must be accounted for. So we went into this recount knowing that we're coming out with a final credible count.
I was so proud that I was part of that happening at the Arthur Chung Conference Center. There were more than 50 of us there, whether you were in the tabulation room or in the different areas that we were checking the ballots. We were part of this total auditing of this election results per se.
We were tasked with the responsibility of observing the opening of the ballot boxes and the counting of the votes, but not only counting of the votes, ensuring that there is legal votes in the boxes.
Some of the basic things we look for when you open a ballot box was to ensure that the statutory documents were there. The statutory documents, and here we talk about not only ballot papers, we talk about certificates of employment, oath of identity, we talk about counterfoils and those things. What GCOM did was to ensure that these statutory documents that they said to us that should be in all ballot boxes, those were the documents that help us to really reconcile what really happened for that particular ballot box at that particular polling station.
But that excitement quickly gave way to concern, as what appeared to be a straightforward process to determine a final credible count rapidly deteriorated before their very eyes. Once the ballot boxes were reopened, it quickly became apparent that on election day, some things had gone terribly wrong.
As days went by, there was this sense of you feeling as though you are not coming out here with a final credible count, because GCOM kept changing the rules of the game as we kept playing the game. GCOM kept changing the basket of rules to satisfy one political party, that is the People's Progressive Party.
At the beginning of the recount process, the rules that existed then were not the rules halfway in the process, and they were not the rules at the end of the process. Throughout the process, the rules kept changing. GCOM commissioners kept meeting to decide on matters that they did not have any answers to. And strange enough, one of those items listed in the basket of issues was what constitutes a valid vote. In that recount process, it had to be decided on what constituted a valid vote. And I can tell you, in the basket of issues that was presented on the 27th of May, it was strange to me that that was one of the things that was highlighted. I think it was it was in bold capitals, if I remember correctly, that what constitutes a valid vote, it was revised on the 26th of May, and then again it was revised on the 27th of May. So at that point in time, what it simply said is votes that was counted or not counted prior to that date was then being considered using a different set of guidelines moving forward. So there was no consistency as to how those votes were being considered at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end of the recount process.
The tabulation of the statements of recount was a tedious process, and one which was also mired in controversy. Captain Daniel Siram and Miss Juretha Fernandez served as tabulation agents for the APNU AFC coalition.
In the tabulation room, we would have received all of the statements of recount. This came from all of the recount stations in which we would have scrutinized along with other counterparts from other political parties. And later on, we would have inputted into spreadsheets. These spreadsheets would have been inputted live some days. Some days they weren't inputted live for whatever reason or the other. And then also, we would have fought very hard to also have the statements of the summary of observations for the statement of recounts being read out. So when we went to this recount process, it wasn't just counting votes 1, 2, 3, 4.
Throughout the day, we had the recount stations doing what they did, and we started off at later on in the evening, the tabulation center. Now, all of that information would come to us, and we will document it and so forth. So we would be in constant contact with the agents in the recount station, so we would know some of the things that are happening. What we would have seen is that even when issues were highlighted in those recount stations by the agents at the end of the day, and mind you, those things would have been sent to the level of the commission for them to deliberate on and to give answers to, yet we had, at the end of the day, those statements of recount still being inputted in the tabulation center, and that was a major issue for us, because how could you be entering in data that is still being deliberated on at the level of the commission?
As the recount unfolded, concern gave way to alarm.
And shockingly, we were not able to verify hundreds of thousands of votes. You had dead people's names that were ticked off on the official list of electors, but they voted. You had people who migrated from this country and they did not return on the day of election, but they voted. You had missing oaths of identity. You had unsigned oaths of identity. You had missing poll books. A number of irregularities, abnormalities, and anomalies were unearthed.
We also discovered that they were talking about oath of identity. That was on the report that is in the particular ballot box. But you did not find in that ballot box those documents, the actual oath of identity, to really show you or to justify that yes, this particular polling station, 23 persons took oath of identity, and here are the documents in order to confirm that, so you could have a clear reconciliation as to totals. You did not get that. So we had those problems occurring.
Coming down from the East Bank areas and Central Georgetown, we would have found a lot of documents were discarded because they didn't have the official GCOM mark on it. That is the official GCOM stamp. So you would have voted, but then because of some official at the polling station that didn't stamp your ballot correctly, all of those votes would have been discarded.
In order to ensure that the people of Guyana received first-hand, credible information on the recount, the APNU AFC carried full coverage of the events. Christopher Jones, Randy Critchlow, and Sherrod Duncan spent 33 days outside the Arthur Chung Convention Center reporting on the recount.
It was a ringside seat for us because even for the scrutineers on the inside who were at the various tabulation centers, they didn't have the kind of view that we had because they were individually feeding us the information and not necessarily coordinating among themselves on the inside before we got it. So we were getting from these various streams, and so we were able to see the patterns long before they themselves saw the pattern. So for instance, we saw what was happening on the East Coast very, very early. We started seeing that. And we started seeing the trend nationally of all of these discrepancies and anomalies, the inconsistencies. And
it was essentially a conscious decision taken on our part that for the want of information, we will ensure that we are present where the information could be sourced, and hence the setup outside of the Artichoke Conference Center. And we can tell you literally from day one, with the commencement of the recount, is that anomalies, discrepancies, missing poll books, and the full gamut. I think, subject to correction, it was either on the first or the second day in which you found the first person who was dead, but on elections day, a vote was cast for that person, and that was out of region number 2.
When those people who were the agents, the recount agents, when they came out to speak with us, you realize, okay, you're talking about region 6, no, region 7, region 9, region 1, those indigenous communities, we saw a particular type of fraud happening there. We saw those oaths of identities missing. So you started to pick up, okay, this is what they're doing in the interior regions.
In addition to the mountain of irregularities and anomalies already discovered, a disturbing trend began to emerge.
But it was a Thursday afternoon when we were just about to start tabulation, and Jarrett and I would have noted there about 3 to 5 boxes, all of them having the same issue.
Yep.
No statutory documents. We would have reported the matter to the GCOM staff, the CEO as well, on that Thursday afternoon, and our party leadership. On the Friday, I think at close of play on that Friday, by midday we would have had 21 boxes with the same issue. No statutory document. By close of play on Friday, you would have had there about 41 boxes, right, with no statutory document. This was the time that I got very upset because something was utterly wrong.
Places like LBI, Lamont Intention, places like Chatamargo, we discover several, I saw several boxes came there. We opened it, and all that were in the box was the ballots. So we had problems in determining how many persons were at that polling station that were eligible to vote or did turn up to vote, because we could not have seen the FVL, the finals voters list, that was supposed to be among that. You understand me? So you can't count to really do that reconciliation.
The boxes that were found were on the lower and upper East Coast, and they were in areas that are historic strongholds of the PPP civic. Coincidental? I think not.
GCOM decided to set aside the ballot boxes that had no statutory documentation and not include those in the tabulated results. But that decision was soon reversed.
Simply put, the Commission was involved in the process, and the process was determined by the casting vote of the chairperson. So that the chairperson, when that decision was made, came down on the side of the boxes being counted.
When the false issue with the statutory documents were raised, it was sent to the tabulation room and said an investigation would be done. The CEO of GCOM was called in by the Commission to conduct an investigation on those statutory documents. One that the public has only heard about but has never been addressed up to now. I make this known here because it's a public statement that was made. The CEO was called in during the recount to investigate the 40 plus boxes at the time. Are you telling me during an ongoing investigation, the Commission would have made a decision to tabulate polluted votes, I would call them, right, in this election?
What remains unanswered in my mind is why, when those persons responsible for those boxes, those GCOM staff, when they were called to a meeting at GCOM, nobody turned up. GCOM called that meeting, and the chief elections officer told this nation that none of those persons turned up.
The 47 ballot boxes from the lower east coast of Demerara, which were discovered to be without any statutory documentation, accounted for in excess of 11,000 votes. To understand how this would affect the outcome of the elections, 7,000 votes equal one seat in the National Assembly of Guyana. The PPPC currently occupies the government by a one-seat majority.
The requirement is that certain documents are filled out and returned to GCOM. It is only during the recount it was discerned that those documents had not been returned, and therefore that deprived us as a basis for what I would consider a proper count of those ballots, because one, in the first instance, could not say how many names were struck off in the various polling stations, and therefore one could not say that the number of ballots found were in fact equivalent to the number of persons who, by the record which should have been there, would have turned up to vote. So that for me, the entire process was eroded by the absence of the documentation in those 47 boxes. One could not give a proper account for what took place in those ballot stations in the absence of that information.
Interestingly, once GCOM decided to tabulate the universal votes, calls from the international community grew louder for a declaration of the elections to be made based purely on the tabulated count. Threats of sanctions and the cutting off of development aid swiftly followed.
The reality is, as the recount manifested the illegalities that occurred, particularly in PPP stronghold, we saw a shifting of the goalposts in which, rather than having the observation report and deal with all the issues that the recount revealed, the narrative became that we only counting the ballots. It didn't matter whether they got there legally or illegally.
It is noteworthy that the ABCE countries, the international media, and international organizations sided with the PPPC and ignored all the issues related to the findings of the recount process. Meanwhile, at the level of the GCOM, the APNU AFC nominated commissioners were advocating for a legal solution which would ensure that no legitimate voter was disenfranchised. These were all rejected by the chairman of GCOM and the PPPC nominated commissioners.
Because it is my view, it was then and is my view now, that every person who voted should have the vote counted. Therefore, you could not simply say you will not count the 47 boxes, because undoubtedly there were persons who did cast a vote in those particular areas. So what does one do? You can't account for the votes because of the absence of the documents, but you can't arrive at the conclusion that you simply cannot count those votes and cast them aside. And in that circumstance, I proffered the idea that there were two options which were available to us. One option is to go for a by-election in that area so that we can ensure that the people who voted, that their votes would in fact be taken into consideration, but at the same time, a by-election would provide for accountability, because then we would ensure that all of the documents required are available. If not a by-election, the other option was to run over the entire elections. For the reason that there were 47 boxes, and those 47 boxes represented a number of votes in addition to the impersonated votes that made a difference in the results.
But why the calls for GCOM to declare tabulated results when thousands of votes could not be verified? Why would pressure be exerted for GCOM to include votes cast in the names of dead persons and persons not in Guyana on election day? Why not allow GCOM to determine a credible final count, as was its intention with Order 60 of 2020? By the end of the process, evidence of massive electoral fraud affecting hundreds of thousands of votes was uncovered in what appears to be a systematic operation by agents of the PPPC employed as election day staff by GCOM. From its insistence that only the Region 4 boxes should be recounted, to the stubborn objection to an audit of the votes in the boxes, the PPPC used every avenue to frustrate the will of the people.
We commissioners, who should have been in receipt of the statements of polls for each and every polling station, abandoned our duty in relation to District 4. We didn't any longer sit there collecting authentic statements of polls, checking them, and we were checking them with ultraviolet rays to ensure that every statement was a valid statement, and then signing off and commissioners receiving copies. We abandoned that exercise. And so in a sense, what we did made it impossible for the declarations, right or wrong, in the various districts, when brought forward, to be checked against results that we had that were valid and authentic, and therefore putting us in a position to respond negatively or positively to what was before us. That wasn't possible because we abdicated our duties. We did not collect the statements of polls for exactly the area in contention, in Region 4, District 4, and more particularly the East Coast. And so, in my humble opinion, much of what occurred could have been avoided. To whose benefit, I don't know. If the commissioners had stayed the course, collected all of the statements, and was in a position to confront or interrogate the results being brought to the Commission for final approval.
Chief Elections Officer of GCOM, Keith Lowenfield, concluded that the elections were not credible. In his report on the vote recount, he observed that widespread irregularities and anomalies had contaminated approximately 60% of the votes. He stated that GCOM could only verify 185,000 of the 460,000 votes cast.
You see, in electoral politics, you may have fraud. But if you can come to the conclusion that the fraud will have no impact on the final result, then though you acknowledge the fraud, you proceed to the final result because the final result is what it is. But in this circumstance, when one takes the number of votes involved in those 47 boxes, and the number of votes involved in terms of impersonation, and what the recount said in terms of the number of seats allocated based on the recount without taking into consideration what I just referred to, then what I just referred to could make a difference to the outcome of the elections. And therefore, in those circumstances, one cannot and should not take those numbers of the recount as a final result because of the big question mark.
International pressure continued for GCOM to declare the results of the elections based on tabulated votes, not on valid votes. In the midst of the courts of Guyana hearing the legal proceedings brought by the APNU AFC to prevent invalid votes from being used to declare the elections, then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced visa restrictions on, as he put it, individuals who have been responsible for or complicit in undermining democracy in Guyana and their immediate family members.
You will find on our program that we had 4 times per day. We were actually saying, okay, so tomorrow it is expected that GCOM will make an announcement. And we expect by this evening to see a statement from the ABCE countries. We were able to do that because, again, that was a pattern that was emerging. Every time the court is about to rule, we expect to hear from Mike Pompeo or Korzak and so forth. So on the program, if you go back to our programs, you will hear us saying that GCOM or the court is about to make a ruling tomorrow. So by tonight, you will expect a statement. And true to bear, the statement came either overnight or just before midnight, the statement came.
In the end, the Chief Justice compelled the Chief Election Officer to declare the March 2020 general and regional elections on the basis of the tabulated votes, which contained tens of thousands of votes that GCOM itself indicated it could not validate. The Chief Election Officer complied, but included the caveat that the results did not meet the standard of a credible election. And so ended a 5-month imbroglio and the theft of Guyana's democracy. The PPPC was installed into office on August 2nd, 2020.
What is worse is that having been installed, they immediately manifested their authoritarian tendencies and they are taking Guyana fast to a dictatorial state. We saw very early the dismissal of African Guyanese for no reason at all. We saw once you were a supporter of the APNU-AFC and you were of another ethnic group, whether you were East Indian or from indigenous populations, you were fired. We saw almost immediately the destruction of the professionalism of the police force, and they immediately began to use the police force against innocent people, including public servants and those elections officers who did their work. We saw the advent of trump-up charges against the people of Guyana. We saw the return of widespread discrimination in the society.
What were the motives behind the actions of the various players, and why did they want to install the PPP in office? What did they stand to gain?
One of the ambassadors was heard to be saying to the chairman of the Elections Commission, These elections are bigger than Guyana. These elections are bigger than Guyana, and therefore you ought to take certain steps. And so this is where the foreign element came in. And this is where the theft of our democracy took place. And it was discovered at the Artichon Conference Center. And every time I go into that conference center now, because Parliament is there and we sit there as members of Parliament, I am reminded of the circumstances in which our democracy was stolen by the PPP, aided and abetted by foreign entities who wanted to see a regime change in this country.
The APNU AFC remains committed to the truth, to Guyana's democracy, and will continue to fight on behalf of the people of Guyana, even as we confront and prevail against the consequences of the theft of our democracy. We can, we must, and we will. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, we fed up of you. We ain't forget all that you do. Stop trying conning we.